Hi, everyone. I'm James Utt. I was mentored by Dr. Sarah Foltz, and my presentation is titled The Effect of Artificial Light at Night on Feeding and Nesting Behaviors in Eastern Bluebirds and Tree Swallows. Thank you all for tuning in. Let's get started. So, I'm very interested in studying how the natural environment is affected by things that humans introduce to those environments. And one of those big things that humans introduce is artificial light pollution. Now, most every place on Earth where humans settle and live features at least some level of artificial light at most times of day. Things such as street lamps, the headlights on cars and other vehicles, and the bright lights coming off many buildings and signs and billboards are considered great producers of artificial light pollution. Now, because electricity has only been available to use for a comparatively short time, artificial light pollution is a relatively new influence on the natural world. One of the biggest and most significant producers of artificial light pollution overall are cities and other large urban areas. The growth and spread of those urban developed environments has led to a similar spread of artificial light in those areas. A recent study by the UN showed that in 2019, over 50% of the world's population lived in these urban environments, and that by the year 2050, that number will have gone up to 68%. In light of those recent developments, I believe it is very important to study how environments and the organisms living within them are impacted by artificial light. So, what does ALP actually do to wildlife? Artificial light at levels low and high has been shown to have several different effects on wildlife, some fairly harmful and some actually fairly beneficial. Maybe the most obvious effect we can think of that increased light levels at night can have on animals is sleep. Higher light levels at night have been shown to be associated with disrupted circadian rhythms, which in turn leads to altered and disrupted sleeping in those affected animals. On the other hand, ALP can also lead to some benefits as well. Animals who depend on foraging for food to survive have been shown to be more successful foragers when living in environments where ALP levels are higher. Those higher light levels let the animals forage for longer periods than usual, allowing them to gain more needed resources. On the flip side of that, higher levels of ALP are also associated with predatory animals having more successful hunts after the sun goes down. So what I wanted to know was how artificial light has been affecting wildlife in our local community around Radford in the New River Valley. My primary research question was, how does artificial light pollution affect nesting and breeding behaviors in both eastern bluebirds, shown here on the left, and tree swallows on the right? I wanted to study those two species of birds because they're both cavity nesters, meaning that they will seek out and build their nests in small holes or cavities wherever they can find them. Now, both of these species make frequent use of nest boxes located along the New River, as well as at the Salu Conservancy. These nest boxes offer great spots for these cavity nesters to live. Those nest boxes are all exposed to different levels of environmental light, so they present a great opportunity to study how those varying ALP levels can alter animal behavior. So going into this, what did I think was going to happen? I had two hypotheses related to the two behaviors I was wanting to study. My first hypothesis, related to these birds' nesting behaviors, was that the birds in this study would choose to build their nests in boxes that are not exposed to higher levels of artificial light, and that boxes in areas with higher levels will see much less use overall. My second hypothesis, relating to the behaviors that go along with care for nestlings, was that birds living in boxes exposed to higher levels of artificial light will spend more time foraging at night than birds living in darker areas. Now, to study these effects artificial light has on bird behavior, we had to actually expose these birds to light. To do that, we installed bright solar-powered floodlights underneath 9 of our nest boxes being used, leaving 27 nest boxes in the dark. Then, using an instrument called a photometer, I took readings of the level of light pollution present at each box. I took this reading at the beginning of the nesting season, in the middle of the nesting season, and again towards the ending of the nesting season. Using those numbers, I was able to calculate an average light level for each nest box. Now, to study how the birds in this research study behaved, I had to perform a series of behavioral observations. Whenever nestlings in a box turned 9 or 10 days old, I sat approximately 50 meters away from the box and observed the behaviors shown by the parental birds. When I performed these observations, I was counting how many times the parent flew into the nest box, how many times they landed on the entrance without entering, and how many times they perched on top of their box. In addition to this, each box was continuously monitored for occupancy in the stage of any nest inside. So statistical analysis of our data is still ongoing and not complete yet, but we can absolutely draw some inferences from the data we've collected. So while we were collecting data, we were able to find that, as expected, boxes with floodlights installed had noticeably higher levels of ALP than boxes without. Boxes exposed to higher levels of ALP were also generally used less often than those in the darker areas. I also was able to observe that feeding behaviors were not noticeably altered at nests exposed to higher levels of ALP. Although once we complete our statistical analysis of our data, we will be able to say for sure what sort of effects the ALP actually did have. Now, some external factors that we were involved with this nesting season may have impacted the collection of our data. For example, Bissett Park, where a good number of our nest boxes were located, was heavily flooded at several points during our nesting season, which prevented us from collecting data at these nest boxes for several periods of time. Another factor that affected our data collection was the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The closure of much of our campus prevented us from using some of our supplies, somewhat limiting the quality of our data collection. Based off the results we found and will find later, there are several next steps that could be taken to continue this project after this nesting season. First off, we've already made plans with the Facilities Department of RU to install more nest boxes around our campus. This would make for a great continuation of this project, as the levels of light on campus vary greatly, even more than in Bissett and Salu, which would make for ideal conditions for measuring variations in the effects had by ALP. Next, we could also make use of floodlights at more of our nest boxes that we used in this study. Having more nest boxes exposed to those bright floodlights would give us a greater sample size, showing us a more realistic look at the effects had by high levels of artificial light. Finally, other effects of urbanization, such as sound pollution, could be studied. A study like this, one that takes a broader look at how urbanization impacts wildlife around it, could be potentially very important for conservation efforts in those areas. I'd like to acknowledge the help I've received from a few people in this project. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Radford University Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarship for funding this project and giving me this great opportunity to share my research. I'd also like to thank my mentor, Dr. Sarah Foltz, for her guidance and help designing and carrying out this project. I would also like to thank Ashlyn Albert, Haley Howren, and Haley Long for helping with data collection throughout the nesting season. And finally, I'd like to thank you for watching my presentation. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them below, and I'll respond to them as soon as I can. Thank you guys for watching.